for years, 25 to be exact, 26, I've been teaching little adults this big and bigger adults that big the fine art of apology and forgiveness. We call it tshuva. And every year we have different versions of the same lesson to learn. And maybe every year we hear the lesson slightly differently because our hearts are more attuned to the need for apology and the cry for forgiveness. And I think what I've done over the years is I've emphasized apology maybe with a loss to forgiveness. Maybe it's time to focus a little more as individuals and as a society on forgiveness. What it means to be Jewish in relation to these days and what it means to be Jewish in relation to these values. So here are the basics. Essentially what we say is, on Yom Kippur evening, we'll say, Bishiva shel ma'ala uvishiva shel mata anu matirin lehitpalel im havaryanim. We create a court in the sanctuary that mirrors and mimics the likeness of the heavenly court, and we say that we, humble people, are willing to stand here or to sit here and to pray among the sinners. But of course, the rabbis realize that no person is outside that circle. We realize that as well. Who comes to these moments and says, I am different from the person next to me because I haven't wronged somebody or many someones in the year past? The rabbis have a beautiful idea of shrinking down all of eternity, our whole lifetime, down to a single year and saying, this is the year to focus on. You get to come clean. You get to wear white again if you've done the work to warrant that change. It's one thing to take the Torah scrolls and to just put white covers where they were once blue and red and scarlet. But ourselves and our souls, it takes much more work. We have to be willing to do that kind of work, to open our hearts and our souls to ourselves and to be reflective, and then to move from reflection into words, and then to move from words into action. That's tshuva. Because words, mere words, saying we're sorry, it's something we teach the little kids that I just shared a story with outside. We teach them a behavior, to be polite in society, to say, I'm sorry. But what we hope is that what we're cultivating them is something deeper and richer inside them, which is the reality of being sorry, of realizing the value of a relationship and knowing that sorry means something to our souls and ourselves and the people with whom we've created distance. So the rabbis say that we have two different kinds of sin. And one of them is the kind of sin that you and I acknowledge, which is the sin in relation to one another, interpersonal sin. It's the things that we do that harm and create distance between us. It's the things that we do that injure each other, words and actions and lack of words and lack of action. And I think all of us from childhood have a reality of that because we see that, but then the rabbis look at the Torah and say, there's a whole other kind of sin, a word we're not wont to use these days, and that's sins before God. And they say that in these days of tshuva, we're meant to be doing the work that we're supposed to be doing with each other, having quiet conversations, loving conversation, creating closeness, taking the cord that's become distant and pulling ourselves closer toward one another in words and in proof through actions of our heart's intent and of our character. But what do we do on Yom Kippur when we arrive in just 10 days from now? And we come to this sanctuary to stand in conversation with God, like stand to have the talit figuratively or literally over our heads and say, this isn't about these relationships, it's about this relationship. And maybe the sins before God are the sins of ritual, the things that we haven't done, the candles we haven't lit, the fasts we haven't done, the services we haven't attended. But I think maybe the sins before God are the sins that we can't somehow forgive ourselves for. And God says, look at me. If you can't look at them, this isn't between you and them. It's between you and you and you and me. You'll find both of us in the mirror of your prayers. Bring your whole self before me. On Yom Kippur, there's a phrase from the book of Numbers that appears in our Torah portion, or I should say in our book, and it stuns me every year, because it doesn't make sense to me in the way that we human beings behave. It's forgiveness before apology. Vayomer Adonai salachti kidvarecha. I know where it sits on the page. And God said, I forgive you because of your actions, because of your words, because of what I see in you. I forgive you before you even confess. Now, if you need to close your eyes for a moment and imagine yourself saying that to someone who needs your forgiveness. And imagine that you have the chen and the chesed, the grace and the compassion to say before they even confess on this day or these days, shh, I forgive you. Now open your heart to me because you're safe. I forgive you because these days and these words and these prayers and these rituals mean something to me. They're not a charade. I forgive you because I don't have the right to do what God refuses to do, which is to cancel a human being. That's not my right. I don't see it in the Torah. I don't see it in the writing of the rabbis. I don't see it in my own self. I don't have the right to say you cannot exist in my world. I have the right, if you're growing and changing, to allow you to continue to grow and to change. So what's an apology? Well, apology, if it's sincere, isn't always accompanied by Bach on the cello. Sometimes. An apology, if it's sincere, is realized in three ways: reflection and words and action. It's I'm sorry accompanied by the reality of change. The reality that I've taken a good hard look in the mirror and seen all of myself, even those parts of me that I'm generally unwilling to look at. It's the kind of apology that says, I needed first to do the work on me to be able to step forward toward you, and then you surprise me by saying, I forgive you before you even say a word. Because I've seen your character growing even in this act of apology. So I come to you once, but you're too angry, or the hurt is too close and too real. It still hurts to think of what you did to me. You have the right, according to our rabbinic tradition, to say, I'm unable to forgive you. Then I step away and I come back at an opportune time, a reasonable time, after a period, an interval, and I come back to you and I say, I want to tell you that since the last apology, I've made strides in my own character. I want you to know what I've been doing in the conversations with myself, the reflective work I've done, and I want, again, to tell you in sincerity that I apologize. And you still have a right this time to say, I can't, parentheses, yet forgive you. And then the rabbis say, I have an obligation one more time to come to you after an appropriate period of time and to say, I'm intent on changing. I'm intent on doing better. Don't pin me to a wall like a butterfly that will never grow or move again. Don't let me be defined in our relationship by a moment or moments. Do what God does and let me flourish. Because God wants you and me to grow and to thrive and to constantly develop. Otherwise, this religious tradition and these beautiful scrolls amount to nothing. If we are fixed at a point in time in 1978 or 1981 or 2021, then we're not realizing the value of this wisdom tradition that says as long as you're growing, you're growing. That as long as you're changing, you're changing. That as long as you're alive and breathing and realizing your potential and your obligations in this world, not only to fall but to rise again after those falls, then God says, I forgive you. I will never cancel you. Then I come to you for the third time, and maybe you say again, I can't forgive you. And the rabbis have a word for you that's extraordinary. It's called achzari. It means the cruel one. It's kind of shocking, isn't it? The rabbis say that to be unforgiving is to be cruel, and how many of us have not at some point withheld forgiveness and realized the power in that hot, seething cruelty, knowing that we're not only harming that person, but we're harming the people who are looking at us for the models of living and for the models of the values of our lives. I look in the Torah and I read this extraordinary story, a chapter in it about King David of Israel. King David, who will be the progenitor to the Messiah. And I see his affair with Bathsheba, and I see what he does to cover that affair by sending her husband, Uriah, off to battle. And if I read that chapter in isolation, I say, canceled and done. His story's invalid. The rest doesn't matter. I fix him like a butterfly to that page, and I don't allow him to move again, but God won't do that. God gives him chapter after chapter after chapter because David becomes a model for you and me of rehabilitation and redemption. Miriam sins, and Moses sins, and Jacob sins, and Joshua sins, and you and I sin, and none of us is incapable or unworthy of God's forgiveness or each other's. So do a quiet inventory in your mind. Connect your heart to your mind. Open that channel, a tunnel between your thoughts and your feelings, your relationships and yourself. And ask yourself what might need to shift, what might be able to shift, what you might be able to create in the days ahead that will illuminate the year ahead. There's an extraordinary story in the Talmud where the rabbis talk about 3 kings of Israel with so much blood on their hands being kings of Israel that went to battle, and it said that they're not allowed into the world to come, but God digs a tunnel under the ground so that they can find a way into the world to come. Isn't that just a beautiful idea? What does it say about you and me? What does it say about the people in our society? That God says, I'm digging away, I'm giving you a channel to emerge and to find wholeness and completeness. Just move forward. Just don't stand still. Just don't stand in yesterday. It doesn't exist anymore. Allow yourself to flourish in this God-given moment. Bishiva shel ma'ala uvishiva shel mata, in the heavenly court and in this court of public opinion. What we read and what we see and what we post and what we comment on and what we say, we have the obligation to bring not only apology, contrition, but forgiveness as well. I fear, as you might, that our society is going in a direction from guilt, which is healthy, to shame, which is deadly. If you look at the signs of societies that have moved, as we have in Western society, away from religion, away from churches, mosques, and synagogues, what you see is we become untethered from the story that teaches us. We become disconnected from the morality that guides us. And what we do instead is we become jazz players. We improvise and find the morals of the given day. We tune a morality of the past out and create a morality that we believe will serve the present and the future, but it doesn't. It doesn't. There was a book that you might have heard of. It was called The Chrysanthemum and the Sword. And it was by an anthropologist by the name of Ruth Benedict. And I think this is an amazing story. I read about it on a page written by the late Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, and then read excerpts of the book. And the book is interesting about culture, and I'll tell you a little about it, what's relevant to today. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, the American government did something interesting, extraordinary, something that you wouldn't imagine a government would do. They called in an anthropologist, and they said, we're going to war against an enemy and a culture that we don't understand. Teach us about Japan and the Japanese. And Ruth Benedict did that. She taught the American government and the war apparatus about the culture and the values of the Japanese. And she said, I want you to understand this one important distinction that differentiates you and them and that will play out on the battlefield. Yours, ours, the American culture is built on religion and a healthy regard for healthy guilt. Guilt can be repaired. Guilt can be changed. Guilt can be erased through action. But Japan's culture is a culture of shame which doesn't have those tools for repair. But you and I do. You and I are a culture in ourselves. You and I lead families and communities. We model behavior through our words, through our posts, through our likes, through our dislikes. We model what we want to see in the world. At any age in our lives, we are all like Torah's teaching. The word for Torah shares its root with mora, which is teacher, and horim, which is parents, which means that there isn't a single human being that isn't contained in a scroll and doesn't contain a scroll, a teaching. for our kids and grandkids and for their kids and grandkids. Even those of us who don't have our own kids, to teach by what we do and don't post, to teach by what we say and don't say, to teach by withheld and given embrace. Those are the lessons that we need. We don't need to look at those leaders whom we'll never meet, government leaders, to change our culture. We are the culture. We are the society. We voted for them to do something different. God voted for us to do something different as well. I want to tell you a story. And maybe it'll be the most important story that I share with you, more even than King David or the Japanese and the Americans. It's a touching story that maybe cements this idea in your mind as it does for me. It's the story of Rabbi Michael Weiser and his wife Julie. They moved to a new community, a synagogue in Lincoln, Nebraska. And they were going to lead a congregation there. And as soon as they arrived, they started receiving hate calls and horrific hate mail. They were called scum. Their lives were threatened. The hate was coming from a man by the name of Larry Trapp, the local Grand Dragon of the KKK. Against all advice, Rabbi Weiser took an unusual approach. He got Trapp's phone number. And he began leaving messages on his answering machine, such as, "Larry, there's a lot of love out there, and you're not getting any of it. Don't you want some?" He left Larry messages every Thursday at 3 p.m. He even offered to take Larry to the grocery store because he knew that Larry was wheelchair-bound, a double amputee from diabetes. The hate mail kept coming until finally one day Larry called the rabbi. And he said, "I want to get out of what I'm doing, but I don't know how." The rabbi went to Larry's home, and they spoke for hours. The rabbi learned of severe abuse in Larry's childhood. Over the next year, Larry worked to make amends to the Jewish community. And as his health deteriorated, he moved into the Weiser family, into their home. He converted to Judaism. At his funeral, the synagogue was filled with people who considered him their friend. He was buried with a Jewish star on his tombstone. I don't need to say more. I'll just say this. May Rabbi Weiser's story and Larry's story change something in us, open something in our hearts. May we look at each other and ourselves with greater love and potential. May we make of this new year nothing short of a miracle. Shana Tova.